As I've stated before on this channel, and you don't need me to tell you this anyway, there weren't an enormous number of American progressive rock acts from the 1970s. Perhaps they just weren't able to get record deals as opposed to those in the UK. Maybe there just wasn't a scene developing, and those that were inspired by the UK prog acts were too much unoriginal imitators and they weren't able to sustain a fan base truly. It's hard to say. One group that did emerge from Chicago, apparently, is this one, Shadowfax. They released this album, Watercourse Way, in 1976. Very pretty and pristine prog release, if you like that sort of thing. Very, very ideal. Those who don't like the genre will not be convinced whatsoever. They will continue to despise the genre. Those who love the genre will continue to dwell in their delightful haven of an echo chamber. It's a glorious world. Actually, Shadowfax did the smart thing, the thing which more prog bands ought to have done, rather than just stick with a style that was kind of unoriginal and stayed and wrote at that point. Shadowfax figured they'd move on into the electronic music genre smartly, and quite well, I would say. I think their 80s output remains fairly strong, like the work of that 80s group Gandalf or Hans Joachim Rodelius of Cluster. There's interesting, fun, and kind of in good mood soundscapes. They become a better Tangerine Dream at that time, because Tangerine Dream in the 80s are a bit hit or miss. Some members leave, you know. Read out the bio of Shadowfax as per Prog Archives. Shadowfax, nice name for a progressive rock band. At least that's how they started off. Named after Gandalf's a horse in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. They're often classified as New Age, but their first album really wasn't. It was rather quite like a more rocking version of Oregon, and had a mixture of hard and soft songs, and really their latter albums weren't completely, although they lost some of their harder edge and devoted themselves to more mellow fare. 3 of the founding members actually got together 4 years earlier in 1972. Chuck Greenberg, winds, G.E. Stinson, guitars, and Phil Magini, bass. Doug Maluchnik joined on keyboards in 1973, and finally Stuart Neverd, who had worked with Maluchnik, who came along in 1974 for drums/percussion, and the ensemble was complete. Their first album, Watercourse Way, was recorded in 1975 and released in 1976 on the ABC/Passport label. This album may not have been well known among progressive music fans, but with its spectacular cover art and well-crafted music, it was a treasured item in the collections of those that knew them at the time, so much so that it was commented on in the CD liner notes of the re-release that fans are always showing up with well-worn copies of the album requesting new versions be made available. The band disappeared for a few years after their debut and then resurfaced on the Windham Hill label in 1982 with a self-titled album of new material. Maluchnik was out, but they brought in a few extra musicians who contributed additional instrumentation on various songs. In 1983, they released Shadow Dance, which saw them getting a little heavier. Jared Stewart was brought in for full-time keyboards, along with Jamil Smadzinski, who had contributed to a couple songs on the previous album as a violinist for all the tracks. Once again, they had several guest musicians on board. They even brought back 2 pieces from their first Passport albums. Next came Dreams of Children in 1984, which is probably the Windham Hill album that comes closest to the heaviness present in some of the music on Watercourse Way. David Lewis replaced their keyboardist from the last album. 1986's Too Far to Whisper saw the band returning to a more new age style overall. The core band remained the same except for the violin seat filled by Charles Bisharat, and had another set of special guests contributing to various tracks. They moved on to another label and cranked out 5 more albums. And now a review uploaded also to Prog Archives from one Slater Bartfast. 5 stars. If you had this album in your collection in the late 70s, it would have been one of your more prized prog albums. While Shadowfax wasn't as well known as some of the big names from the 1970s, partly because they only did 1 album then, their first one was absolutely stunning. Better known for their usually mellower output for the Windham Hill label, this is a tasty mixture of heavy and mellow music. If you can judge an album by its musicians' instruments, how about this? Bass, cowbell, drums, tabla, percussion, guitar, sitar, vocals, lyricon, saxophone, soprano, flute, recorder, oboe, clarinet, piano, electric piano, synthesizer, moog, sequencer, harpsichord, keyboards, chamberlin. Okay, some of those are fairly conventional, but what they did with those musically is something else. Still plenty of good things happening in 1976, but this album was in the same league as any of the great albums by the great names in progressive rock at the time. If you have to relate their music to similar artists, Mahavishnu Orchestra, Gentle Giant, and Oregon come to mind in particular. A testament to the power of this album, though they went for 6 years before releasing their next album, they still had a legion of loyal fans that would show up at concerts with well-worn copies of this album wanting replacements. In 1985, the Windham Hill label granted us our wish and released it a new version, remixed and with additional recording, minus the excellent original cover art. Alas, this release is also out of print. As an interesting footnote, Larry Fast, aka Synergy, co-produced the original album. He was putting out albums on the same Passport Records label. Anyone devoted to 1970s progressive rock releases, there's no reason to avoid 1976's Watercourse Way by the great Shadowfax. Thanks again.